Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. is one of those events that just stops you in your tracks. It was April 4th, 1968, 6:05 p.m. at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. One bullet, and the course of history changes forever.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the fragility of everything, the sheer impact of that single act of violence.
It's hard to wrap your head around it. We've got your research here, articles, official reports, even some personal accounts. And honestly, the more you dig into this case, the more questions you have. We know James Earl Ray confessed and was sentenced to 99 years, but was that the whole story? Were there others involved?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And today we'll try to untangle that for you. We'll look at what we know for sure about that night in Memphis and examine some of the theories that have surfaced over the years.
Okay, so let's start by setting the scene. King wasn't in Memphis for a vacation. He was there supporting a strike by sanitation workers.
Right. African-American sanitation workers who were fighting for basic rights and fair treatment. They were protesting unequal wages and incredibly dangerous working conditions. Powerful moment in the civil rights movement. And King's presence there really highlighted the connection between racial justice and economic justice.
And this wasn't just some theoretical issue for King. Two workers had actually been crushed to death in a malfunctioning garbage compactor truck. That's what really sparked the strike.
And what's so fascinating here is how King's involvement in the sanitation workers' strike marked a real shift in his activism. He was beginning to focus more on economic inequality and the plight of working-class Americans.
He was broadening the scope of the fight, so to speak, and he knew it was dangerous work. I mean, King had been receiving death threats for years.
Oh, absolutely. As early as the mid-1950s, he was targeted. And it wasn't just idle threats. His home was bombed in 1956. He was stabbed in 1958.
He was living under constant threat. And it's documented that he was aware of this. He even talked about it with his wife, Coretta, saying, "This is what is going to happen to me. Also, I keep telling you, this is a sick society."
Knowing what we know now, it's tough to hear those words.
And he wasn't just staying at any random motel in Memphis either. He was at the Lorraine Motel, a place he and his colleagues frequented. They even had a suite named after him and Ralph Abernathy.
It's almost eerie how this place, a place that offered him a sense of familiarity and comfort, became the setting for his assassination.
And even his last words are sort of haunting. He was talking to musician Ben Branch, saying, "Ben, make sure you play 'Take My Hand, Precious Lord' in the meeting tonight. Play it real pretty."
A man thinking about music, about bringing people together, moments before his life was taken. It's a powerful image.
Okay, so let's talk about the assassination itself. We've got these eyewitness accounts from people like Reverend Samuel Kiles and Reverend Jesse Jackson, who were with King on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. What do they tell us about what happened in those final moments?
Well, they paint a picture of a pretty ordinary evening that suddenly turned horrific. King was just stepping out of his room, getting ready to go to dinner. He was talking with Jackson and others when a single shot rang out.
I'm curious about the specifics of that shot. What type of weapon was used and what kind of damage did it inflict? It feels important to understand the brutality of the act.
It is a gruesome detail, but I think it helps us grasp the magnitude of what happened. The fatal shot came from a Remington Model 760 rifle, firing a .3006 hunting bullet. It entered King's right cheek, severing his jugular vein and major arteries, and then traveled down his spinal cord, causing irreparable damage.
So this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a deliberate, precise, and ultimately fatal attack.
Exactly. The bullet's trajectory, the type of weapon used it, all speaks to a level of planning and intent.
And what about the immediate aftermath? What happened in those chaotic moments after King was shot?
Chaos. People were screaming, running for cover. Abernathy, King's close friend and colleague, rushed out and found him lying on the balcony, blood pouring from the wound. They desperately tried to help him to stop the bleeding, but it was clear the injury was catastrophic.
I can only imagine the terror and confusion. Did they immediately know who was responsible? Were there any suspects at that point?
No, not at all. In those initial moments, it was just sheer panic and a scramble to get King medical attention. He was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, but despite the doctor's best efforts, he was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m.
Less than an hour after that single gunshot. And a nation in mourning. So King is gone. And now the focus shifts to finding the person responsible. You'd think that would be the end of the story. But with this case, it was really just the beginning.
Right. The nation was reeling, and there was this immense pressure to find whoever pulled the trigger.
And the investigation was massive, wasn't it? The FBI, headed by J. Edgar Hoover himself, took charge. But even from the start, there were questions, doubts, and a feeling that maybe we weren't getting the whole story.
Absolutely. And some of those questions revolved around the FBI's own role. Hoover had a long history of animosity towards King and had been surveilling him for years. Some people wondered if the FBI missed crucial warning signs or even if they were somehow involved in the assassination.
Let's talk about the manhunt for James Earl Ray. He managed to escape Memphis and was on the run for 2 months. What can you tell us about his journey and how he was eventually caught?
It was like something out of a spy novel. Ray, using the alias Eric S. Galt, managed to slip out of the country and into Canada. He spent some time in Toronto, even obtaining a Canadian passport under a fake name. From there, his trail led to Europe, where he spent time in Portugal and England.
So he was a ghost, moving through the shadows, trying to stay one step ahead of the authorities. But he left clues, didn't he? There must have been a trail of evidence that investigators were able to follow.
He did, and investigators were meticulously piecing together his movements. They traced his purchases, his travels, his interactions with others. It was like a giant puzzle, with each piece slowly revealing a clearer picture of Ray's flight.
And eventually, those pieces led to London Heathrow Airport, to be exact. That's where the net finally closed in. What can you tell us about the moment of Ray's capture?
On June 8, 1968, after 2 months on the run, Ray was apprehended at Heathrow Airport. It was a dramatic moment the fugitive finally captured. He was trying to board a flight to Rhodesia, a country that had a white minority government at the time. Investigators believe he may have been seeking refuge there.
I can imagine the sense of relief when he was finally caught. Not just for the authorities, but for a nation that was still deeply traumatized by King's assassination. But of course, catching him was just the first step.
Exactly. There was this collective sigh of relief, a feeling that justice was at least in motion. But the real work was just beginning. They had the man, but did they have the whole story?
So Ray is brought back to the U.S. to face trial. What was his defense? Did he maintain his innocence?
Initially, he did. He claimed he wasn't even in Memphis at the time of the assassination, but the evidence against him was pretty damning. His fingerprints were found on the rifle. Witnesses placed him near the scene, and there's that trail of purchases and travel records that connected him to the crime.
And then there was the Raoul story, right? Ray claimed he was set up, that this mysterious figure Raoul was somehow pulling the strings.
Right. Ray insisted that this Raoul character was the mastermind behind the assassination, that he'd been manipulated and framed. But investigators couldn't find any evidence of this Raoul person. Ray's descriptions of him were vague and inconsistent, and no one else ever corroborated his story.
So it started to feel like Raoul was more of a convenient scapegoat than an actual accomplice.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the trial itself. Did it actually go to trial? Did we ever get to hear Ray defend himself in court?
No, we didn't. In a move that surprised a lot of people, Ray, on the advice of his attorney, Percy Foreman, decided to plead guilty to first-degree murder.
Why would he do that? If he was innocent as he claimed, why not fight the charges?
Well, Foreman, a very experienced defense attorney, believed that the evidence against Ray was just too strong. He convinced Ray that a jury trial would almost certainly end in a death sentence. The guilty plea, while admitting guilt, would at least spare his life.
So it was a calculated risk, a way to avoid the death penalty.
Exactly.
Right.
And it worked in a sense. Ray was sentenced to 99 years in prison.
But for some, that plea deal only fueled the conspiracy theories, right? If he was innocent, why confess? Was he coerced? Were there backroom deals happening?
Absolutely. The fact that we never had a full trial where all the evidence could be presented and examined left a lot of people wondering if the whole truth ever came out.
And then there's the whole issue of motive, right? What was Ray's motive for assassinating King? Was it simply racial hatred? Was he a lone wolf driven by bigotry?
That's one of the biggest unanswered questions in this whole case. Ray himself never gave a clear or consistent explanation for why he killed King. Some people believe he was a racist who acted alone, while others think he was part of a larger conspiracy, a pawn in someone else's game.
That lack of a clear motive adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
It does, and it's one of the reasons why, even after all these years and despite Ray's confession and conviction, people are still searching for answers, trying to make sense of what happened that night in Memphis.
Okay, so we have James Earl Ray behind bars. He's confessed to the crime, but the doubts linger. There's this feeling that maybe there's more to this story.
A lot of folks just couldn't accept that a small-time criminal like Ray could have pulled off something this big all on his own.
Yeah, you start to think, who benefited from King's death? Who had the motive and the means to orchestrate something like this? And some pretty wild theories emerged.
Some focused on the Mafia. There was a speculation that King's activism was interfering with their operations, maybe disrupting their gambling or bootlegging rings in Memphis.
Organized crime silencing a powerful voice. That's the kind of stuff you see in movies.
It is a compelling narrative, and it gained some traction because of a man named Lloyd Jowers. He owned a restaurant near the Lorraine Motel, and in 1993, he came forward with some pretty explosive claims.
This is where things get really interesting. What exactly did Jowers allege?
Jowers said he was part of a conspiracy to kill King. He claimed he was approached by a man with connections to the Mafia who offered him a large sum of money to help with the assassination.
So he's saying he was in on it.
Mm.
And what was his role in this alleged plot?
He claimed he provided the rifle used to shoot King and that the fatal shot was fired from his restaurant, not the rooming house where Ray was staying. He even implicated a local produce merchant named Frank Liberto, who allegedly had ties to the Mafia.
Wow, that completely changes the whole story. Did investigators take Jowers seriously?
They did investigate his claims, but they couldn't find enough evidence to back them up. Jowers never identified the actual shooter, and his story had a lot of inconsistencies.
But it's easy to see how his story would capture people's imaginations. It fits into that whole narrative of powerful forces working behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just the Mafia, right? There were theories about government involvement as well.
Oh, absolutely. Jowers also claimed that elements within the government, specifically the FBI, were aware of the plot to kill King and may have even played a role. This theory really took hold in certain circles, especially given the FBI's history of surveilling and harassing King. That's
right. We talked about J. Edgar Hoover's obsession with discrediting King.
Yeah.
If you're prone to believing in conspiracies, it's not hard to connect those dots.
Exactly. And the fact that many of the FBI's files related to the King assassination remain classified for decades only added fuel to the fire.
Okay, so we have these competing narratives. The official story of James Earl Ray acting alone versus this web of conspiracy theories involving organized crime and maybe even the government. How did the King family navigate all of this?
It must have been incredibly difficult for them. Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s widow, always maintained that her husband's death was the result of a conspiracy. She felt that Ray was just a pawn.
And Jowers' story, while shaky in some aspects, seemed to confirm her suspicions.
Right. It gave her a framework for understanding what she already believed to be true. And it led to a pretty remarkable event in 1999. The King family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Jowers.
They weren't after money, were they?
No, they were seeking the truth. They asked for symbolic damages of just $100. It was a way to bring their case before a jury and to challenge the official narrative. In a verdict that shocked a lot of people, the jury found Jowers liable for King's death and awarded the King family the $100 they had requested.
Wow, so in a court of law, at least someone other than James Earl Ray was held accountable for King's death.
It was a huge moral victory for the King family, a vindication of their belief that there was more to the story than the government was letting on.
But even with that verdict, the official narrative didn't change, did it?
No. The Department of Justice still maintained that Ray acted alone. They argued that the evidence against Jowers was flimsy and that the jury's verdict was based more on emotion than facts.
So we're left with this unresolved tension. On one hand, you have the official investigations and Ray's confession. On the other, you have these persistent doubts fueled by unanswered questions and the deep-seated belief, especially within the Black community, that the full truth has never been revealed.
Yeah, it's a really powerful example of how history can be so contested, so open to interpretation. We may never know for sure everything that happened that night in Memphis, but that doesn't mean we stop asking questions.
So what can we say for sure about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.?
Well, we can say it was a turning point in American history, a tragedy that exposed the deep divisions and injustices of the time. It was a blow to the civil rights movement, a loss of a leader who had inspired millions. And it's an event that continues to resonate today, reminding us of the ongoing struggle for equality and justice.
It's also a case that reminds us that sometimes the truth is elusive, buried under layers of secrecy, conflicting accounts, and the passage of time.
Exactly. And it's up to each of us to examine the evidence, to weigh the different perspectives, and to come to our own conclusions.
This is another great story for Simon and Tom to talk about in their weekly review on Sunday. But in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.